The morning sun crept over the edge of the city like a shy child, spreading its pale light on cracked pavements and half-empty streets. Amid the faint hum of traffic and the distant hiss of steam from a corner coffee shop, a boy named Ethan Cole stood at the intersection, his arms full of folded newspapers that smelled of ink and rain. He was only 20, thin as a matchstick, with a faded denim jacket and a smile that seemed too kind for someone who had so little. Every day, he stood there before dawn, calling out headlines to strangers who rarely looked him in the eye. But Ethan didn't mind. He had learned long ago that kindness wasn't a currency people spent often, yet it was the one he could afford to give away freely. His mother, who had passed 2 years earlier, had once told him, "Son, the world doesn't owe you love, but that doesn't mean you stop giving it." Those words had become his compass. Life for him was not about what he earned, but what he gave: an extra newspaper to an old man who couldn't pay, a smile to a tired nurse walking home from her night shift. It was enough to make the gray days bearable. But that particular morning was different. As Ethan stood beneath the flickering streetlight on 5th and Maple, his eyes caught a figure sitting against the cold brick wall of an alleyway. A young woman, her knees drawn close to her chest, mascara streaked across her pale cheeks like ink bleeding through paper. She wore a sequined dress that looked expensive once, but now hung limp and torn. The heel of one shoe was broken, and her hair, once golden, was tangled like seaweed after a storm. Ethan hesitated. He had seen women like her before. People whispered about them, cursed under their breath, or crossed the street to avoid them. But he didn't move away. There was something about the way she stared at the ground, not in defiance or shame, but in quiet exhaustion, that stopped him cold. He set his bundle of newspapers down and walked toward her, cautious but sincere. "Miss," he said softly, "are you all right?" She didn't answer at first, only rubbed her arms as if trying to erase something invisible from her skin. When she finally looked up, her eyes were the kind that had seen too much and hoped too little. "Do I look all right to you?" she murmured bitterly, her voice hoarse but trembling beneath its hardness. "Sorry," Ethan said, his voice gentle, "didn't mean to bother you. You just look like you could use a warm cup of coffee." She laughed, a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You offering charity now, newspaper boy?" Ethan smiled faintly. "No, ma'am, just coffee." That moment, brief and fragile, became the thread that would stitch two broken worlds together. Her name was Lila, once a dancer, once a dreamer, once a daughter someone prayed for. But life had teeth, and it had bitten her hard. She had come to the city chasing the neon promise of fame, but found instead the shadowy corners of desperation. Nights blurred into mornings in dim clubs, men with wallets and hollow hearts, laughter that cost too much. Debauched, that's what they called girls like her. She hated the word, not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't tell the whole story. It didn't tell how she cried on nights when her reflection felt like a stranger's, or how every smile she faked made her feel like she was sinking further into a life she no longer wanted. Ethan didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that she looked cold. He walked to the coffee shop on the corner and returned with 2 steaming cups. "Here," he said, holding one out. She eyed it warily, then took it, her trembling fingers brushing his. "You shouldn't talk to people like me," she muttered. "Why's that?" he asked. "Because," she said with a hollow laugh, "people might think you're one of us." Ethan looked at her with that calm, steady kindness that seemed to live in his bones. "Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing," he said. Something in his voice, something simple, unpolished, but true, made her blink back tears. They sat there for hours, sipping coffee, talking about nothing and everything. She told him fragments of her story, about how her father stopped calling, how the world chewed up innocence and sold it by the hour. He listened without judgment, his eyes soft but unflinching. "Do you ever feel like it's too late to start over?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled. "All the time," he said. "But then I remember, the sun still rises even after the darkest night. That's its way of starting over." For the first time in years, Lila smiled, a real smile, small but alive. From that day on, Ethan would see her often. Sometimes she'd come by his corner with a coffee for him, sometimes just to talk. He learned that beneath the makeup and the pain, Lila had dreams, of painting, of dancing not for money but for joy. He encouraged her to try again, to find something worth believing in. But the city is cruel to those who try to change. One night, she didn't show up. Then another. Ethan worried. Days turned to weeks until, one rainy evening, he saw her again, standing across the street, soaked, bruised, clutching a torn coat. She ran to him and collapsed in his arms, sobbing. I tried to leave, she whispered, but they wouldn't let me. I'm nothing, Ethan, nothing but what they say I am. He held her tighter, his voice breaking. You're not what they say. You're what you choose to become. That night, he took her to the tiny apartment he called home. Just a mattress, a lamp, and a stack of books. He gave her his only blanket and made her tea. She looked around, her eyes wet. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because, he said simply, someone once gave me kindness when I didn't deserve it. I'm just passing it on. She cried again, quietly this time, as though tears were washing away the shame she'd carried too long. Over the next few weeks, she began to heal. She found small jobs, cleaning, waitressing, and started painting again. Ethan sold more newspapers than ever, not because people suddenly cared, but because he cared more about each one. They were both poor, but they were rich in something the world couldn't sell, hope. One morning, Lila showed him a painting, a city skyline at dawn, with a small figure holding newspapers, standing beneath golden light. That's you, she said. No, Ethan smiled, that's us. But happiness, fragile as it was, came with its trials. One afternoon, as Ethan crossed the street to deliver papers, a speeding car struck him. The newspapers scattered like white wings across the road. Lila screamed and ran to him, her hands shaking as she held his head in her lap. Ethan, please, don't leave me. His breathing was shallow, his lips pale. Hey, he whispered weakly, remember what I told you. The sun still rises, tears fell on his face like rain. Don't talk, she begged, please. He smiled faintly. Promise me, you'll keep starting over. His hand went limp, and for a moment, the world stopped turning. Lila sat there, clutching him, her cries echoing through the street. The same city that once ignored her now stood still, watching the girl they had judged and the boy they had never noticed. Days later, at his small funeral, she placed a newspaper on his grave with a single note, thank you for showing me the meaning of clean hands and a clean heart. Months passed, but Lila didn't disappear into the shadows again. She opened a tiny art studio called The Rising Sun, where she taught children from the streets to paint and dream. A photograph of Ethan selling newspapers hung on the wall with the caption, kindness doesn't need wealth, it just needs courage. People came from all over to hear her story, the story of a girl who had been lost and a boy who gave her back her soul. She would tell them, her voice trembling but full of light, he was just a newspaper seller, but he sold hope without knowing it. And she'd smile through tears, I was broken until he reminded me that redemption isn't found in forgetting your past, it's found in forgiving yourself. On the anniversary of his death, she walked to the same street corner, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The city was different now, brighter, kinder. She placed 1 cup on the pavement where he once stood and whispered, you were right, Ethan. The sun still rises. And as the first light broke across the skyline, she lifted her cup to the sky and smiled. No longer the debauched girl the world had named her, but the woman he had believed she could become. Because love, in its purest form, doesn't always come wrapped in romance or wealth. Sometimes it comes from a boy with ink-stained hands and a heart big enough to save someone the world had already thrown away. And in that simple, quiet miracle of kindness, both their souls found what they had been searching for all along. Peace, purpose, and the courage to begin again.